I came to the mountains to disappear. That was the only honest way I could describe it to myself in those first raw weeks after the funeral, when every familiar street and sympathetic face felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I needed somewhere that didn't know my name, didn't know what I'd lost, didn't expect me to heal on anyone's timeline but my own. The village appeared through the snow, like something out of a half-remembered dream, a cluster of stone houses clinging to the mountainside, prayer flags snapping in wind so cold it burned my lungs. The documentary work was supposed to be my excuse, my cover story for running away. I told myself I'd come here to film the high-altitude wildlife, the snow leopards and barrel that moved through these peaks like ghosts. But the truth was simpler and more desperate than that. I had come here to be alone with my grief, to let the silence of these ancient mountains swallow the questions I couldn't answer. The villagers welcomed me with the careful politeness reserved for outsiders who don't understand the rules of a place. They gave me a small house on the edge of the settlement, brought me butter tea and tsampa, asked about my cameras with genuine curiosity. But I noticed things in those first days that unsettled me in ways I couldn't quite name. The way conversations would stop when I mentioned hiking to the upper valleys. The manner in which the elder women would touch small amulets at their throats when the wind shifted direction after sunset. How no one's livestock grazed beyond a certain ridge, even though the grass there grew thick and untouched. When I asked about the best locations for filming, the village headman, a weathered man whose face held the texture of the mountains themselves, would redirect me toward the lower slopes with gentle insistence. There were better vantage points down here, he assured me. More animals, safer paths for someone traveling alone. I attributed it to reasonable caution at first, perhaps concern about avalanches or unstable trails. But there was something else beneath his words, something that felt less like warning and more like an old unspoken agreement. The younger villagers would translate his concerned suggestions, but their eyes would drift toward the high peaks as they spoke, and I could see something there that wasn't quite fear, more like reluctant reverence. I'm a scientist by training, a documentarian by trade. I'd spent 15 years filming in remote locations, from the Amazon to the Arctic, and I'd learned to separate local superstition from genuine environmental hazards. So I smiled, nodded, accepted their tea and their concern, and privately planned my own routes into the forbidden territory they wouldn't name. On my fourth night in the village, I woke to a sound that changed everything. It came rolling down from the peaks in the hours before dawn, carried on wind that rattled the wooden shutters of my room. At first, I thought it was wind itself, the way it can howl through narrow valleys and create phantom voices in the dark. But as I lay there in my sleeping bag, breath fogging in the frigid air, I realized this sound had structure. It rose and fell with something too deliberate to be random, too complex to be any animal I'd encountered in all my years of fieldwork. It reminded me somehow of whale song, those long, mournful calls that travel through ocean depths. But this was terrestrial, massive, and impossibly distant. I fumbled for my recording equipment in the darkness, my hands shaking from cold, and something else I didn't want to examine too closely. By the time I had the microphone positioned at the window, the sound had faded into the general whisper of mountain wind. But I'd heard it. My body knew I'd heard something that shouldn't exist, something that made the hair on my arms stand up and my heart pound with a mixture of fear and fierce professional excitement. In the morning, I asked about the sounds. The faces around me went carefully blank, and someone mentioned wind patterns in the high passes, but I saw the way the elder women exchanged glances, and I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't the first person to ask that question. That was when I understood my real work here had nothing to do with snow leopards or the documentary proposal gathering dust in my laptop. Something lived in those upper valleys, something the villagers had made their peace with through silence and distance, and despite every rational instinct I'd cultivated over a career built on observable facts, despite the grief that had driven me here seeking nothing but emptiness and quiet, I felt the first stirring of something I thought had died with everything else I'd buried. Purpose. The kind that comes not from running away, but from moving toward the unknown with your eyes wide open, ready to witness whatever truth waits in the thin air and ancient snow. I began preparing for an expedition into the forbidden territories the very next morning, telling myself it was professional curiosity, knowing in my bones it was something closer to destiny. The mountains had called to me in a voice that predated language, and every cell in my body understood that I had not come here by accident. Something in those peaks was waiting, had perhaps been waiting far longer than I could imagine, and I was finally ready to listen. The sounds came again the following night, and this time I was ready. I'd positioned my equipment throughout the small house, directional. Microphones at each window, backup recorders running continuously, my best parabolic setup aimed at the upper valleys where the slopes disappeared into permanent snow and cloud. When the vocalizations began, perhaps 2 hours after midnight, I was sitting in darkness with my headphones on, and the clarity of what I heard made my hands freeze on the recording controls. This was no wind. This was no animal I had ever documented. The sounds moved through frequencies that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate in my chest, my bones, the base of my skull. They carried patterns that my rational mind insisted were random, while something older in my consciousness recognized as intentional. I thought of the last conversation I'd had with my daughter before the accident, the way she'd tried to tell me something important but couldn't find the words, settling instead for sounds of frustration and love that language couldn't hold. This reminded me of that. Communication straining against the limitations of expression, meaning trapped inside a voice that no longer had the right shape for the message it needed to deliver. I recorded for 3 hours straight that night, until the vocalizations faded with the approach of dawn and exhaustion pulled me under, despite the adrenaline singing through my veins. In the morning light, I sat with my laptop and analyzed the audio files with every tool I had. The spectrograms showed complexity that made my throat tighten. There were harmonics layered beneath the primary calls, patterns that repeated with variations suggesting intentionality rather than instinct. I isolated segments and played them back at different speeds, watching the waveforms dance across my screen like a language I was missing by just a few degrees of understanding. When I played the recordings for the family in the neighboring house, asking if they'd heard anything unusual, the grandmother, a woman whose face held 90 years of mountain wisdom, went completely still. She listened to perhaps 15 seconds before making a gesture I didn't recognize, something between a blessing and a warding off. Her grandson translated her words reluctantly, his voice barely above a whisper. She asks that you not seek the old one who watches. She says he has been alone too long and his grief is not meant for human ears. I should have listened to her. Some part of me knew even then that I was crossing a threshold I couldn't uncross, moving from the realm of scientific inquiry into something far more dangerous and sacred. But grief has its own logic, and mine had hollowed me out enough that fear couldn't find purchase anymore. I'd already lost everything that mattered. What were ancient warnings and village superstitions compared to that? So I began planning my expedition into the upper valleys with methodical determination, treating the warnings as data points rather than wisdom. I studied topographical maps, identified the most likely source locations for the sounds based on acoustic analysis, packed my equipment with the careful precision of someone who'd done dangerous field work in dozens of remote locations. The villagers watched my preparations with expressions that mixed pity and resignation. They brought me supplies I hadn't requested, butter lamps, blessed scarves, packets of juniper for burning, gifts that felt less like provisions and more like funeral offerings. The headman came to my door the evening before I planned to leave, and through the translator he told me something I would remember in the days to come. He said the Old One had been speaking to the mountains long before his grandfather's grandfather was born, that the sounds I was chasing were not greetings but lamentations, and that some sorrows were too vast for outsiders to witness, without being changed by them. I thanked him for his concern and left at first light, following the forbidden paths into territory marked by absence. No prayer flags, no cairns, no sign that humans had walked here in generations. The snow was deep and untouched, the silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. I hiked for 6 hours before. I heard them again, the vocalizations I'd been chasing, but this time they were different, closer, more focused, as if whatever was making those sounds knew I was coming and was deciding what to do about it. I set up my first camera trap near a rocky outcropping where the snow had been disturbed in ways that made my scientific training collide with my disbelief. The tracks were massive, bipedal, and absolutely fresh. They led toward a cave system carved into the mountainside, the entrance marked with symbols worn almost smooth by weather and time. I photographed everything with shaking hands, my breath coming in rapid clouds, my heart hammering against my ribs. Above me, from somewhere, in the gathering dusk, came a sound that was unmistakably a response to my presence, not a warning, not a threat, something closer to acknowledgement, or perhaps question. The Old One who watches had found me first, and the real documentation was about to begin. I spent the next 3 days in that forbidden zone, establishing a perimeter of observation that felt less like scientific protocol and more like building a shrine. My camera traps went up at intervals around the cave entrance, positioned to capture movement from multiple angles, their infrared sensors creating an invisible web of detection. I set up my base camp 200 meters downslope, close enough to monitor my equipment, but far enough to avoid direct intrusion into what I was increasingly certain was a dwelling place. The symbols carved around that cave entrance haunted my thoughts during the day and followed me into fitful sleep at night. They weren't random markings or natural erosion patterns. They were deliberate, purposeful, a form of communication or protection that predated any written language I recognized. I traced them with my gloved fingers that first afternoon, feeling grooves worn smooth by centuries of wind and ice, and something in their arrangement spoke of boundaries. These were not warnings to keep out, they were promises to something within, offerings of respect, carved by hands that understood they shared this mountain with forces deserving of acknowledgement. The realization settled over me like snow accumulating on branches. I wasn't the first human to seek the Old One, but I might be the first in generations to do so without understanding the protocols my presence was violating. The sounds continued each night, but their character had shifted in ways my equipment captured, but my analytical frameworks couldn't quite explain. They came from different locations now, circling my position at distances that varied between 100 meters and what must have been kilometers away, echoing off canyon walls, with acoustic properties that made triangulation nearly impossible. On the second night, I heard what I can only describe as mimicry. Fragments of my own movements echoed back at me in auditory form. The crunch of my boots in snow translated into vocalizations that captured not just the rhythm, but somehow the intention of my careful approach to check camera batteries. The zip of my tent translated into a sound that made me laugh despite my nervousness, because it was simultaneously perfect imitation and alien interpretation, as if something was learning my language of presence by reflecting it through a consciousness shaped by entirely different rules. I began leaving my recorders running continuously, abandoning any pretense of targeted documentation. Whatever was happening here exceeded my categories. This wasn't wildlife behavior. This was interaction, conversation, a form of contact that my training had never prepared me for. I thought again of my daughter and the games we'd played when she was small, the way she'd mimic my words before she fully understood them. Testing, sounds in her mouth like physical objects, learning meaning through repetition, and variation. On the third evening, my camera traps captured what I'd been simultaneously seeking and dreading. The footage was brief, perhaps 8 seconds, shot in the failing light just after dusk, when the world balanced between visibility and darkness. A figure moved between 2 ancient pines at the edge of the clearing, and even compressed into digital video, the size of it defied immediate comprehension. Towering, yes, easily over 2 meters, but it was the movement that stopped my breath. Fluid, purposeful, nothing like the lumbering gait my cultural imagination had assigned to such creatures. It moved, with the confidence of something that belonged here, absolutely, that knew every stone and root, every change in wind and temperature. When I slowed the footage down, frame by frame, I could see the head turned toward the camera, and though the resolution wasn't sharp enough to capture detail, I felt the weight of that gaze through the screen. It knew. The camera was there. It had chosen to be seen. I sat in my tent with my laptop glowing in the darkness, replaying those 8 seconds until they were carved into my memory, and I understood with sudden clarity that I hadn't found evidence of anything. I had been granted permission to witness. The old one who watches had decided to watch back. That night, I reviewed the audio recorded during those same 8 seconds, and what I heard drove me to my knees in the snow outside my tent, tears freezing on my face before I could wipe them away. Beneath the wind and the ambient mountain silence, my equipment had captured vocalizations of such structured complexity they could only be described as speech attempting to happen. Phonemes rose and fell in patterns that suggested grammar, syntax, meaning straining toward expression through a vocal apparatus not quite shaped for the language it was trying to form. But more than the structure, it was the emotion that shattered something inside me. The sounds carried sorrow so profound it seemed to have weight and texture, grief that had been refined by time into something pure and terrible. This was not animal communication. This was not even human speech. This was something older, bearing witness to its own erasure, speaking into the void with the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might finally understand. I thought of all the recordings I'd made in my career, thousands of hours of animal vocalizations analyzed and catalogued and published, and I knew with absolute certainty that nothing I'd documented had prepared me for this. I wasn't recording a creature. I was being entrusted with a testimony, and the old one who watches was finally, after generations of silence, finding someone willing to listen. I became a student of sorrow in those days that followed, learning to recognize emotional registers in sounds that existed outside human phonetic range. Each night I sat in the entrance of my tent with my equipment surrounding me like electronic sentinels, recording the vocalizations that now came with regularity between the hours of dusk and dawn. Patterns emerged from what I'd initially perceived as random calls, repetitions with variations, phrases that seemed to answer each other across distances, a structure that suggested not just communication, but contemplation. The old one was not simply making noise, it was speaking to itself, or perhaps to memories, rehearsing something that needed to be preserved. I began responding in my own way, playing back recordings at low volume, not in mockery but in acknowledgement, and the change was immediate. The vocalizations shifted in tone, became more frequent, moved closer to my position. I was being evaluated, tested, invited into a dialogue I barely understood. On the 5th night, I heard something that made my hands shake as I adjusted recording levels. Embedded in the sorrowful vocalizations were approximations of human speech patterns, as if the old one was trying to bridge the gap between our methods of meaning-making, teaching itself my language even as it taught me the vocabulary of ancient grief. The footage from my camera traps accumulated into a gallery of glimpses, each capture revealing more while somehow deepening the mystery. I had 17 separate videos now, ranging from 3 seconds to nearly 20, and together they formed a portrait of intentional revelation. The old one appeared always at dusk or dawn, in that liminal light that softened the boundary between visible and invisible, and each appearance was positioned to show more detail than the last. I could see now the silvery white fur that covered its body, darker around the face and hands, weathered by centuries of mountain winters. I could see the musculature beneath that fur, powerful but not brutish, adapted for vertical terrain and extreme cold. Most strikingly, I could see the face in profile, and the bone structure there destroyed every assumption I'd carried. This was not the face of an ape or missing evolutionary link. The brow ridge, the set of the jaw, the way the head balanced on the neck, it suggested intelligence, consciousness, personhood. In one frame, where it had turned directly toward the camera, I caught the eyes for just a moment before the video ended, and they held an expression I'd only ever seen in humans who'd experienced profound loss. Awareness of what had been and would never return, the terrible weight of being the last witness to vanished. Beauty. I started leaving offerings at the edge of my camp, feeling foolish and sacred at once, dried fruit from my supplies, a wool blanket that had belonged to my daughter, objects that felt like gestures of respect rather than attempted bribery. They remained untouched for 2 days, and I felt the sting of rejection, the worry that I'd misunderstood everything. But on the third morning, the blanket was gone, and in its place was an arrangement of stones that matched the symbols carved around the cave entrance, a response in the visual language of boundaries and belonging. I traced the pattern with my fingers as tears came freely now, understanding that communication was happening, in forms that transcended both our limitations. That night, the vocalizations came from directly above my camp, and I emerged from my tent to see a silhouette against the stars, perched on an outcropping perhaps 50 meters upslope. We stayed like that for timeless minutes, woman and legend regarding each other across the darkness. And I heard myself speaking without planning to, telling it about my daughter, about the accident, about the guilt that had driven me to this mountain. The words came in a flood, and though I knew it couldn't understand my language, I felt certain it comprehended my sorrow, recognized in my grief an echo of its own endless mourning. The breakthrough came on, the 7th night, when my audio equipment captured something that would later change everything. Between the haunting vocalizations, I heard syllables that approximated words, not English, not any modern language, but phonemes that carried the ghost of human speech. I isolated the segments, cleaned the audio, played them back at different speeds, and finally heard it clearly. Fragments of what might have been words, repeated with desperate precision, as if the old one was reciting something it had learned long ago and refused to forget. The next morning, I hiked down to the village and found the elder who'd first warned me away, playing the recording on my portable speaker in his small home, that smelled of butter tea and smoke. His face transformed as he listened, cycling through disbelief and recognition and something approaching fear. "Old tongue," he whispered, his hands trembling as they gripped his prayer beads. "Before Tibetan, before Sanskrit, the language of the first people who made pact with mountain guardians." He closed his eyes and spoke the words I'd recorded, translating as best he could remember from stories his grandmother had told. "Remember us. Remember the bond. Do not let the watching end in silence." The elder's house became my classroom in the hidden curriculum of forgotten history. For 3 days, I sat across from him as he unfolded stories that had been compressed into folklore, myths that were actually memories preserved across generations like insects in amber. He spoke of a time before the current age, when the high valleys supported communities that understood themselves not as conquerors of the mountain, but as children in its household. These ancient peoples had lived in partnership with beings they called the Kangmi, the snow walkers, the high guardians, creatures of profound intelligence who served as intermediaries between human settlements and the mountain's deeper consciousness. The relationship had been formalized in ceremonies and reciprocal obligations. Humans would maintain sacred boundaries, perform seasonal rituals of gratitude, and preserved the stories of interconnection. In return, the guardians protected travelers, warned of avalanches and storms, and held the knowledge of safe passages through terrain that could kill the unprepared. But empires rose and fell. Religions swept through the valleys, erasing older cosmologies, and gradually the pact eroded. Into superstition, the guardians dismissed as primitive fantasy. The Kangmi retreated higher, appearing less frequently, until they existed only in cautionary tales told to children. But one remained, the elder said, his voice dropping to barely above whisper. The oldest, who took an oath that could not be broken, to watch and remember until humans returned to right relationship, or until the last witness dissolved into mountain mist. I understood then what I was actually hearing in those nocturnal vocalizations. Not animal communication or even primitive language, but the recitation of sacred memory, an oral archive maintained by a consciousness cursed with the burden of perfect recall. The Yeti I'd been tracking was performing an act of desperate preservation, speaking aloud the names and stories and ceremonial words that would otherwise vanish completely from the world. It was the last priest of a dead religion, the final keeper of a library that existed only in its memory, and every night it preached to the empty darkness because the alternative was unthinkable, allowing millennia of relationship to disappear as if it had never existed. The sorrow in its voice was not personal grief, but existential anguish, the pain of being unable to die while everything it was created to protect crumbled into forgetting. My own loss suddenly felt different in this context, not diminished, but connected to a larger pattern of severed bonds and unwitnessed endings. I'd come to this mountain to hide from grief, but instead I'd stumbled into a story about what happens when grief has no community to hold it, when mourning becomes eternal, because there's no one left to complete the ritual of letting go. I thought of my daughter's voice, which I'd recorded on my phone and played back compulsively, unable to let the sound of her fade, and recognized in that desperate repetition my kinship with this ancient being. The elder gave me words to speak, phonetic approximations of phrases from the old tongue, and made me practice until my pronunciation satisfied some internal standard he wouldn't explain. "You must go back," he finally said, his eyes holding mine with unexpected fierceness. "The Old One chose you because it recognized another keeper of impossible memories. It will reveal more, but you must be prepared for what comes with witnessing." He placed a white ceremonial scarf in my hands, worn, soft with age, explaining it had belonged to his grandmother, who claimed to have once seen a guardian near this same cave system in her youth. "If it accepts this, you will see things not meant for the forgetting world, and once seen, you cannot unsee. Your life will belong partly to this story forever." I accepted the scarf, knowing he was right, feeling the weight of commitment settle into my bones. That night in my tent, I didn't sleep, replaying the elder's words and my recorded vocalizations, preparing myself for a threshold I sensed approaching. Outside, the wind carried sounds that might have been weather or might have been calls, and I found myself answering without the recording equipment, using my human voice to attempt the phrases I'd been taught, sending my intention into the darkness. "I am ready to remember with you." The 8th morning arrived wrapped in profound silence, the kind of stillness that precedes transformation. I emerged from my tent to find the entire area around my camp transformed into a gallery of stone arrangements, dozens of patterns laid out in the snow during the night while I'd slept my shallow sleep. They formed a path leading upward toward territory I hadn't yet explored, a clear invitation rendered in the grammar of sacred geometry. Among the stones was my daughter's blanket, returned but now marked with something I initially thought was dirt, but realized upon closer inspection was a pigment made from crushed rock and ice. I followed the stone path for 3 hours, climbing through terrain that tested every skill I'd developed in 20 years of documentary work. The arrangements continued at intervals, confirming I was moving in the intended direction, each configurations slightly different, as if they formed sentences in a language of placement and proportion. My breath came hard in the thin air, but I pushed forward with the ceremonial scarf wrapped around my neck, and the words the elder taught me cycling through my mind like a mantra. The landscape shifted as I climbed, becoming less familiar, the rock formations taking on shapes that seemed almost architectural, suggesting human intervention from some impossibly distant era. Then the path opened into a narrow valley I hadn't seen on any of my maps. A hidden basin completely enclosed by peaks that created a natural amphitheater of stone and snow. The acoustics were extraordinary, every sound amplified and clarified, and I understood immediately why this place had been chosen for whatever was about to happen. In the center of the valley stood a structure, not quite a building but more than random geology, formed from massive stones arranged in a circle, with a central pillar that rose perhaps 15 feet high. The surfaces were covered in the same symbols I'd seen at the cave entrance, but here they were more elaborate, telling what seemed to be a continuous narrative that spiraled up the central column. I approached slowly, documenting everything with my camera, aware that I was likely the first outsider to see this place in generations, perhaps centuries. The weight of that privilege pressed against my chest with almost physical force. I was photographing the symbols when I felt, rather than heard, its presence behind me. The air changed, becoming somehow more attentive, charged with focused consciousness that made my skin prickle with awareness. I turned slowly, following the protocol the elder had described. Keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening, my eyes lowered in respect rather than challenge. The Yeti stood at the valley's entrance, perhaps 50 feet away, and the reality of its physical presence overwhelmed every concept I'd constructed from tracks and distant footage. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, its body covered in silver white. Fur that moved in the wind like water, its face holding an expression of such profound intelligence that my breath caught in my throat. This was no missing link or evolutionary curiosity, but a being of obvious sophistication, its eyes carrying the weight of accumulated centuries, like a grandfather holding memories of a world the young could never comprehend. We regarded each other across that space, and I felt my own story dissolving into insignificance, my grief becoming a single note in a much longer song of loss. I reached slowly for the ceremonial scarf, holding it out as the elder had instructed, and spoke the phonetic phrases I'd practiced, my voice shaking with emotion I couldn't fully name. The Yeti's eyes widened fractionally, registering what might have been surprise or recognition, and it vocalized in response, a sound that moved through frequencies human vocal cords couldn't possibly produce. Yet somehow I understood the emotional content perfectly. It was acknowledging me, accepting my presence in this sacred space, granting permission for the witnessing that was about to unfold. The creature moved toward me with unexpected grace, each step deliberate and measured, closing the distance until it stood close enough that I could smell its scent, like cold stone and ancient wood and something else indefinable, perhaps the smell of time itself. It reached out one massive hand, the fingers surprisingly delicate despite their size, and touched the scarf I still held extended, then brought those same fingers to its chest in a gesture that transcended cultural barriers, a sign of acceptance and shared recognition. Then it did something that shattered my remaining assumptions. It knelt, bringing its face level with mine, and began to vocalize in a pattern that was clearly intentional communication, structured and rhythmic, pausing occasionally as if waiting for me to comprehend. I fumbled for my recorder, hands shaking, and it watched patiently as I set up the equipment, seeming to understand the importance of documentation, the necessity of making this moment permanent. When I indicated I was ready, it began again, and this time I heard beneath the alien frequencies something impossible, fragments of recognizable phonemes, broken pieces of the ancient dialect the elder had taught me, mixed with sounds no human throat could form. It was demonstrating its linguistic capacity, proving it possessed not animal cunning, but true language, complex communication shaped by culture and intention. Between vocalizations, it gestured toward the stone pillar, then to the mountains beyond, then to its own chest, and finally to me, creating a narrative sequence that seemed to mean this history, this place, this responsibility, now shared with you. The teaching that followed had no clear boundary between minutes and hours. The Yeti moved through the valley, pointing to specific locations, vocalizing over each one, and gradually I began to understand I was being given a geography lesson in sacred memory. Each site marking a story or ceremony or significant event from the lost civilization that had built this place. It showed me depressions in the stone where offerings had been made, faint carvings depicting humans and guardians standing together in configurations that suggested cooperation and mutual respect, evidence of a relationship that had been central to both species' understanding of their place in the mountain's ecology. At the base of the central pillar, it cleared away snow to reveal an inscription more elaborate than the others. And when it vocalized over these symbols, its voice carried such profound sorrow that tears began streaming down my face without conscious decision. I didn't need translation to understand this was a memorial, perhaps for the last humans who had kept the pact, or for other guardians who had once shared this vigil but had finally surrendered to time's erosion, leaving this one alone to maintain the impossible burden of remembering everything on behalf of beings who had chosen to forget. It placed its hand on the stone with obvious reverence, then looked at me with eyes that held a question. I could somehow read, "Will you help me carry this? Will you remember with me so I'm not alone in holding these stories?" I placed my hand beside its massive one on the cold stone and spoke the words the elder had taught me, the phrases meaning something like, "I see you, I witness, I will hold this with you," and the Yeti's entire body seemed to release tension I hadn't noticed it was holding, a relief so visible it was almost painful to witness, the burden of absolute isolation momentarily lightened by the presence of another consciousness, willing to share the weight of sacred memory. The Yeti moved to the central pillar and began vocalizing in a new pattern, more urgent and structured than before, its hand tracing the spiral of symbols that wound upward toward the sky. I adjusted my recorder to capture every frequency, every nuance, sensing that what was about to be communicated represented the core of everything I'd been brought here to understand. As it vocalized, it would pause and point to specific symbols, then to itself, then repeat the process with what felt like increasing desperation, as if racing against some invisible deadline. The wind picked up around us, creating harmonics in the valley's natural amphitheater that seemed to amplify and clarify its vocalizations, and suddenly I began hearing patterns within patterns, recognizable word shapes emerging from what I'd thought was simply sophisticated animal communication. It was speaking, truly speaking, in fragments of that ancient dialect mixed with sounds that predated human language entirely, and the recorder in my trembling hands was capturing proof that would overturn every assumption about consciousness and communication. The creature's eyes never left mine as it vocalized, checking constantly to see if I comprehended, if the message was penetrating, and when I nodded in recognition of certain repeated patterns, its expression showed something unmistakably like relief, mixed with grief. This was not just communication, but confession, testimony given by the last witness of a vanished world, and the responsibility of receiving it pressed against my chest until I could barely breathe. The elder's lessons suddenly crystallized in my mind, and I began to distinguish individual concepts within the vocalizations: guardian, covenant, waiting, forgetting, ending. The Yeti was recounting the history carved on the stone, but with emotional context the symbols alone couldn't convey, filling the ancient record with lived experience, spanning generations beyond human comprehension. It pointed to symbols near the pillar's base and vocalized in tones of warmth and harmony, indicating a time when humans and guardians had worked together, when both species had understood their roles in maintaining the mountain's sacred balance. Then its hand moved higher on the spiral, and the vocalizations shifted to confusion and sorrow as it indicated the symbols marking humanity's gradual withdrawal from the pact, the villages moving to lower elevations, the ceremonies ending, the language being lost to time's erosion. Higher still, and the sounds became almost unbearable, frequencies that resonated in my bones with accumulated loneliness, marking the death of the last human who could speak the full covenant language, leaving the guardians without the ability to communicate their purpose to the beings they were sworn to protect. The Yeti's hand reached the top of the pillar, where the spiral ended in symbols I'd initially thought were incomplete, but now understood represented absence, the blank space where future history should have been carved but couldn't be, because there was no one left to record it. Then it did something that broke my heart completely. It began to vocalize in clear, broken fragments of modern language, words it had obviously learned from decades or centuries of distant observation, piecing together human speech like a child assembling a puzzle with missing pieces. "Remember," it said, the word distorted but unmistakable, its voice box struggling with phonemes it wasn't designed to produce. "Please, remember, we hear the effort it took to force those syllables into existence was visible in its entire body, muscles trembling with the strain of bridging the gap between our species through sheer desperate will. It pointed to the monuments around us, then to itself, then made a gesture that encompassed everything from the valley to the peaks beyond, to the sky itself, repeating those painful words, "Remember, remember." I was openly weeping now, the recorder still running in my hands, capturing this impossible moment when a being from another evolutionary path was begging in my own broken language not to be erased from the world's memory. It knew it was dying, not individually perhaps, but as a species, as a function, as witnesses to a covenant humanity no longer believed in, and it was using its final reserves of strength to ensure that at least one human understood what was being lost. The creature reached into the thick fur on its chest and withdrew something I hadn't expected, something that suggested planning and intention that went far beyond animal behavior. A carved stone pendant hanging from a woven cord, clearly made by human hands, marked with symbols matching those on the pillar. It held the pendant between us, vocalizing over it with reverence, and I understood this was a sacred object, perhaps the last physical proof of the covenant given to the guardians by the ancient people who had built this valley. The Yeti looked at me with eyes that held a question and a plea so clear no language was necessary, then slowly, deliberately, placed the cord around my neck, transferring the weight of that ancient promise to my shoulders. Its massive hands adjusted the pendant against my chest, and it vocalized one more broken phrase that sounded like "carry, tell, not alone." I gripped the stone with both hands, feeling its weight and age, and spoke the covenant words I'd learned, promising through tears that I would carry this story, that I would tell the world what I'd witnessed, that this guardian would not be forgotten while I still drew breath. The Yeti turned from the central pillar and began walking toward the far end of the valley, moving with purpose through the snow, between monuments that grew older and more weathered the deeper we went. I followed without hesitation, my hand clutching the pendant against my chest, feeling its warmth despite the cold that bit through my layers. We passed structures that defied my understanding of ancient architecture, buildings carved directly into cliff faces with precision that suggested tools or techniques lost to modern knowledge. their doorways scaled for beings much larger than human, but designed with unmistakable artistic intention. The creature paused at each significant sight, vocalizing brief phrases, while gesturing to specific features, and though I couldn't translate everything, the emotional content was clear. This had been a shared space, a community where two vastly different species had built something extraordinary together. My camera captured it all, but I knew even the highest resolution couldn't convey the weight of standing in a place that rewrote human history, that proved civilization and consciousness had taken paths we'd never imagined. The wind carried sounds through the valley that might have been echoes or might have been something else entirely, whispers of all the voices that had once filled this space with purpose and belonging. I found myself thinking of my own loss, the tragedy that had driven me to these mountains seeking emptiness, and realized I'd instead found the opposite. Proof that connection transcends species, that grief is universal, that remembering the dead gives meaning to the living. We reached the valley's end where a massive stone archive rose against the mountain face, its surface covered in carved panels depicting scenes of cooperation between humans and guardians across what must have been thousands of years. The Yeti approached the wall and began touching specific panels in sequence, vocalizing continuously, as if narrating the story carved in stone, its voice resonating in frequencies that made the air vibrate. I saw humans and guardians hunting together, building together, conducting ceremonies under star patterns I'd need an astronomer to date. I saw them defending the mountain from threats depicted as dark shapes with wrong proportions, suggesting the Covenant had a protective purpose against forces both natural and perhaps supernatural. I saw guardians cradling human children and humans tending to wounded guardians, evidence of bonds so deep they crossed the fundamental divide between species. Then I saw the decline, panels showing humans leaving, guardians waiting at empty gathering places, ceremonies performed alone, and finally a single guardian standing amid abandoned structures while snow slowly buried everything. The Yeti's vocalizations as it touched this last panel were almost unbearable, a sound that contained generations of accumulated sorrow, and I understood this wasn't just history but autobiography, that this being before me might be the very same guardian depicted waiting through the centuries for a return that never came. The creature moved to the archive's center, where a section of wall stood uncarved, blank stone waiting for a story that had never been inscribed. It placed both hands on the empty space and vocalized in tones of such profound finality that my legs nearly buckled, the meaning clear even without translation. This is where our story should have continued. This is the future that was stolen by forgetting. It turned to me then, reached out and gently took my hand, guiding it to touch the blank stone alongside its own massive palm. And in that moment of contact I felt something I still can't adequately explain. A rush of images and emotions that might have been sophisticated communication, or might have been something closer to shared consciousness. I saw the mountain as the guardians experienced it, felt the Covenant as a living thing that connected all beings to the land itself, understood that what had been lost wasn't just a culture, but an entire way of existing in balance with forces larger than individual survival. When the contact broke, I staggered backward, my hand burning with cold and significance, and the Yeti watched me with an expression that asked the most important question. Would I complete the story? Would I carve the final chapter that ensured both species were remembered not for their separation, but for what they'd achieved together? I raised my camera, with shaking hands, and photographed every panel, every symbol, every detail of the archive, while the Guardian waited with infinite patience. When I finally lowered the camera, I spoke the Covenant words again, adding my own promise in English that felt inadequate but necessary. I would tell this story. I would make the world see what had been, Forgotten, I would ensure that this valley and its last guardian would live beyond the ending that seemed inevitable. The Yeti responded with a vocalization that felt like acceptance and blessing, then did something that shattered my heart completely. It vocalized what sounded unmistakably like gratitude, those broken fragments of my language, mixed with its own ancient tongue, to create a hybrid expression of relief that someone finally had heard and understood. It touched the pendant on my chest one more time, then turned toward the valley's exit, indicating our time in this sacred space was complete. As we walked back through the monuments in gathering darkness, I realized this entire encounter had been orchestrated, that the creature had been waiting perhaps decades for someone capable of receiving its message, and I had been chosen not despite my grief, but because of it, because I understood the desperate need to keep memory alive when everything else has been taken away. We emerged from the valley as night claimed the mountains completely, and the Guardian led me back to my camp through darkness so absolute that I could barely see my own feet. Yet it moved with certainty that suggested it knew every stone and drift intimately. My equipment was exactly as I'd left it, untouched through hours that felt like crossing between worlds, and the creature stood at the edge of my camp's light watching as I checked my camera and recording devices with trembling hands. The footage was there, all of it, proof that would shake foundations of anthropology and history. But as I looked at the Yeti's face in the monitor's glow, I realized documentation wasn't enough. This being didn't need scientific validation. It needed what I'd needed when I came to these mountains, what every grieving soul searches for in the aftermath of unbearable loss, acknowledgement that their suffering mattered, that the ones they'd lost wouldn't be erased by time's indifference. I set the camera down and approached the Guardian empty-handed, no technology between us, just two beings who understood what it meant to be the last keeper of memories too precious to release. The creature watched my approach without fear, and when I stopped within arm's reach, it slowly extended one massive hand palm up, in a gesture so universally human in its vulnerability that tears finally broke through my professional composure. I placed both my hands on its palm, feeling the rough skin and impossible warmth, and spoke aloud the names of everyone I'd lost, the tragedy that had hollowed me out and sent me running to the world's edge, seeking either healing or oblivion. The Yeti listened with complete attention, its eyes reflecting starlight and something deeper, and when I finished, it vocalized a response that needed no translation, a sound that acknowledged my pain as valid and real and worthy of being witnessed. Then it spoke names too, or what I interpreted as names, a litany of sounds that must have been the guardians who'd stood watch before this last one, companions and family who'd dwindled one by one until only this single witness remained. We stood there in the freezing darkness, sharing our dead, two completely different species, united by the fundamental experience of loving what cannot be kept. And I understood that this moment was the true purpose of everything that had led me here. The creature's other hand moved to its chest, where my pendant's twin must have rested, and it vocalized the covenant words again, but this time with a different inflection, transforming them from sacred oath to something else. Goodbye. Thank you. Be well. Remember us. I felt the meaning in my bones, the recognition that this would be our final meeting, that the Guardian had fulfilled its purpose by finding someone to receive its testimony, and would now make whatever choice the last of any species must eventually face. The Yeti stepped back and reached for my recording device where it sat on the equipment case, its massive fingers surprisingly gentle as it lifted the small machine. For a long moment it simply held the device, turning it slowly, as if understanding that this object contained its voice, its story, its proof of existence, and would carry that evidence beyond the mountains to a world that had forgotten such beings ever walked alongside humanity. It brought the device close to its face and vocalized directly into the microphone, a long, structured statement that I knew instinctively, was a message meant for anyone who would eventually hear this recording, words in that ancient language that deserved proper translation and serious consideration. When it finished, the creature held the device out to me with both hands, like an offering or a sacred trust, and as I accepted it, our fingers touched again, that same electric recognition of consciousness, meeting consciousness across the vast divide of form and origin. The Guardian vocalized one final phrase, and though I didn't know the literal translation, I understood its essential meaning. Tell them we were real. Tell them we tried to preserve what mattered. Tell them that forgetting has consequences. Tell them there is still time to remember before the last voices fall silent forever. The blizzard rose as if summoned, snow suddenly whipping through the camp with force that turned the air white and opaque. The Yeti stepped backward into the storm, its form becoming indistinct almost immediately, but it didn't turn away, maintaining eye contact, even as the snow consumed it. I heard its vocalizations even after I could no longer see its shape, that haunting call echoing through frequencies that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my chest, where grief and purpose had become impossible to separate. The sound grew more distant but no less clear, and I realized it was moving in, a pattern circling the camp once, twice, 3 times, a farewell ritual or blessing that I received with head bowed and heart breaking for everything this being represented. The calls faded gradually, stretched thin by distance and storm, until I couldn't distinguish them from the wind's voice, and I stood alone in my camp, clutching the recording. Device and pendant, the last human to be trusted with a message from a world that should never have been allowed to disappear. The snow fell harder, erasing tracks and evidence, returning the mountain to its secrets. But I had what mattered: testimony, footage, audio, and the transformed understanding that some encounters change, not just what we know, but who we are. I would return to civilization and share this story, would fight to be believed and to protect whatever remained of the Guardian's world, would ensure that the Yeti's voice reached beyond academic circles, to touch anyone who'd ever loved and lost and wondered if memory alone could be enough. As I packed my equipment with fingers numb from cold and emotion, I whispered my own promise into the storm, knowing somehow it would be heard. You will not be forgotten, your people will not be erased, and the covenant you kept through centuries of solitude will be honored by at least one human who finally understood what you were trying to preserve. I returned to civilization 3 weeks later with footage that should have launched 1,000 expeditions, but I discovered that truth without context is just another curiosity, easily dismissed by those who've decided what's possible before examining the evidence. The scientific community viewed my recordings with polite skepticism, explaining away the Yeti's structured vocalizations as pareidolia, the massive figure in my video as misidentified wildlife or elaborate hoax, the ancient monuments as natural rock formations interpreted through exhausted perception. They dissected my testimony with clinical precision, searching not for understanding, but for the logical flaws that would allow them to file. My experience under delusion or attention-seeking, and I realized the Guardian had been right about humanity's willful forgetting. We've become so committed to our narrow definition of reality that we dismiss anything challenging those boundaries, preferring comfortable certainty to the humbling possibility that we share this world with consciousnesses we've never bothered to acknowledge. But I persisted, taking my story beyond academic gatekeepers to platforms where people still possessed curiosity, unconstrained by institutional skepticism. And slowly, something unexpected happened. The responses came not from scientists, but from others who'd experienced encounters they couldn't explain. Indigenous communities who'd always known about the old ones, who watched from wild places. Conservationists who recognized the Yeti's message as urgent warning about what we lose when we destroy the last refugees of mystery. My footage became not proof for skeptics, but validation for believers, a gift to everyone who'd ever sensed that the world contained more than materialism could measure, and the Guardian's voice reached exactly the audience that needed to hear it most. The village elder helped me translate the final message the Yeti had recorded, working through the ancient dialect with careful reverence, and when he finished, his hands were shaking. The creature had spoken a prophecy and a plea, warning that when the last Guardians disappeared, humanity would lose more than another species. We would sever the final thread connecting us to the sacred contracts our ancestors made with the living world. These beings had been witnesses to human potential, keepers of memory from an age when we understood ourselves as participants in something greater rather than masters of everything smaller, and their extinction would mark not just biological loss, but spiritual catastrophe. The message contained specific instructions too, locations of other hidden valleys that still held evidence of the ancient covenant, sacred sites that needed protection before development. Erased them completely, and a request that anyone hearing this testimony should go into their own wild places and listen, truly listen, for the voices that still speak to those willing to hear. I organized expeditions to the coordinates the Guardian had indicated, finding exactly what the message promised: archaeological evidence of civilizations that had structured their entire existence around cooperation with beings we'd relegated to myth. The discoveries should have rewritten history, but instead they sparked fierce debate about interpretation and authenticity, as if accepting this evidence would require too fundamental a revision of humanity's self-conception. I realized then that the Guardian's real message wasn't for institutions or authorities. It was for individuals willing to let mystery back into their lives, to acknowledge that grief and wonder and responsibility were inseparable threads in the fabric of meaningful existence. The transformation the Yeti's story worked in me was more profound than any documentary success or scientific validation could have achieved. I had entered those mountains as someone running from unbearable loss, seeking nothing but distance from pain, and I emerged as a keeper of testimony that demanded I re-engage with the world despite its capacity for destruction and forgetting. The personal tragedy that had hollowed me out became not an ending but a qualification, because understanding loss was prerequisite for comprehending what the Guardian had been trying to preserve through centuries of solitude. I established a foundation dedicated to protecting the sites the Yeti had revealed, working with local communities who'd always known these places were sacred, and I discovered that my real work wasn't convincing skeptics, but supporting the people who already understood that respect for mystery was the beginning of wisdom. The pendant I'd been given became the foundation's symbol, reproduced and shared with everyone who committed to honoring the ancient covenants, and I watched a network form of individuals who'd chosen to live as if consciousness and sacredness extended far beyond human boundaries. My grief didn't disappear, but it found purpose, transformed from a wound that isolated me into a bridge, connecting me to everyone who'd ever loved something precious and fought to prevent its erasure. I understood finally that the Guardian hadn't saved me. It had recognized that I was already walking the same path, already committed to witnessing and remembering despite the pain inherent in that choice. And it had trusted me with its story because loss had prepared me to carry it with appropriate reverence. The last footage on my recording device, captured just before the blizzard made visibility impossible, shows the Yeti standing at the boundary between my camp's light and the mountain's darkness, and if you watch carefully you can see it place one hand over its heart in a gesture that transcends species and language. I've watched that moment thousands of times, and each viewing reveals new layers of meaning. The way its eyes hold both sorrow and hope, the slight forward lean, as if it wanted to cross that boundary but knew it couldn't, the resigned acceptance in its posture that comes from being the last of anything precious. The Foundation shares this footage freely now, no paywalls or academic gatekeeping, because the Guardian's message belongs to everyone willing to receive it, and I've seen it change people the way that Encounter changed me, cracking open the certainty that we already know everything that matters. Some viewers dismiss it as skilled fabrication, but others recognize the truth that burns through every frame, the impossible-to-fake presence of a conscious being making deliberate choices about how to communicate across the vast gulf, separating human from other-than-human intelligence. The audio analysis remains inexplicable to linguists, structure too complex for animal vocalization, but vocabulary too ancient for modern translation, and that ambiguity is exactly as it should be, mystery preserved rather than dissected into sterile certainty. I think often about the Guardian now, wondering if it survived that blizzard or if our encounter was its chosen ending, a final act of purpose before releasing its centuries-long vigil, and both possibilities break my heart while also feeling somehow right. Whether the Yeti still walks those forbidden valleys or has passed into the same legend that holds all its predecessors, the story survives, the covenant is remembered, and the testimony of the last Guardian continues to echo through everyone willing to listen to voices the world insists cannot exist. What would you do if you encountered something that shouldn't exist but clearly does? Would you have the courage to believe your own experience over society's comfortable certainties? And if you knew your testimony might be dismissed or ridiculed, would you still speak truth about what you witnessed in those liminal spaces where mystery still survives? Subscribe to hear more stories of encounters that challenge everything we think we know about the world we inhabit and the consciousness we share it with.